Thank you so much, and what a privilege. Yes, I want to pick up on this provocation from neuroscience about where it is that we can turn the power of our minds. So, in 2013, British society was rocked by a public scandal. Jimmy Savile, one of the foremost British public figures, a children's television presenter, who the British public had been acquainted with for decades, was found to have been molesting hundreds of children in his care. Amongst the loud outcry of public outrage, there was a small but vocal minority that wondered aloud, what was everyone so surprised about? The guy was so clearly a pedophile, openly parading his attraction to underage girls on national television. The point is, what was supposedly hidden and unthought of had been on the surface for everyone to see for years. And such acts of feigned surprise are symptomatic of neurosis. Ours seems to be the neurotic tendency to refuse to confront the underside of our institutions, thereby allowing society's darker tendencies to hide in plain sight. And one does not need to look far in our international order for instances of such neurosis. To take a glaring example, our collective response to climate change is nothing but humanity's refusal to confront its own existential challenges. Half a year on from Glasgow, not one of the COP26's 196 member states is yet to submit a formal blueprint that goes nearly far enough to curb emissions to prevent a rise in global temperatures more than 1.5 degrees. We're perfectly cognizant of the threat, and yet ours seems to be the resolve to turn and look the other way. And our international order is shaped by the collective thinking of we international lawyers. And our collective thinking, as this climate change example shows, is plagued by this neurosis. Now, Sigmund Freud tells us that this neurosis can be traced to the unconscious in an individual's mind. That is, the most intimate parts of oneself, our desires, our fantasies, and our beliefs, are largely taken from an outside. That is, an influential social environment of parents, of friends, of mentors, of teachers, of enemies, of language and culture more broadly, but especially of popular culture. So the neurosis that plagues an individual's unconscious is often derived from the society itself. But what constitutes the fabric of these social institutions? The behaviors of we individuals. That is, the ideologies, fantasies, and unconscious desires of individuals are what support the underside of our social institutions. And as the Jimmy Savile example shows, that underside is not always clean or healthy, but rather obscene and dirty. So if we think about our global leaders' refusal to confront climate change and our wider international order, then we see that neurosis describes a sort of vicious cycle between the individual and society. In the one direction, our unconscious neurosis in the individual's mind is inherited from these darker tendencies of our social institutions. In the other direction, those darker undersides are themselves constituted by individuals' unconscious tendencies and desires. And this may give you to think that, well, if neurosis so deeply penetrates our international order, what hope do we have for bringing about a better tomorrow? I answer that we each already possess what we need to overcome this neurosis, but to understand how, we must go to where neurosis lies in the everyday fabric of international order. Our international legal order is nothing but what international lawyers are, what they say and do, and crucially, it is a life lived by individuals as international lawyers rather. And we international lawyers, both practitioners and scholars, are problem solvers. That is, confronted with international crises, we draw upon our reserves of international legal rules and principles, our know-how of legal argument, as well as our professional experience to find a way through. That is, we apply our expertise, and that's what we're trained about. But not only that, we too have occasional flashes of imagination. We take leaps and we arrive at novel solutions. More routinely, we reason using metaphor, using image, using perspective taking. That is, we apply our imaginations, but we apply our expertise, but we too apply our imaginations. But to give you an idea of how our expertise and our imagination is involved in our problem-solving processes, I want to dwell for a minute on the legend of Archimedes' Eureka moment. As the legend goes, the king of Syracuse asks Archimedes to determine whether the crown gifted him by his goldsmith is of pure or counterfeit gold. Archimedes is instructed that he cannot simply melt the crown to find out its purity. And so, lost in thought on his problem, he wanders over to the public baths. And there in the public baths, getting into the water, he's struck by a flash of insight, and Eureka, he cries, or so the legend goes. But I want to slow down Archimedes' problem-solving process to show just how his acts of expertise and his acts of imagination interplay with one another. On the way to the baths, Archimedes is lost in thought. He's drawing upon his reserves of knowledge to find a different way of framing the problem, a different set of tools by which he can arrive at a solution. That is, he's applying his expertise, and these efforts of applying his expertise are what primes his imagination to have the flash of insight upon entering the bath. Once Archimedes has entered the bath, he notices that the water levels rise. But not just that, he too feels his own buoyancy. His imagination kicks in there and then, and he sees that the amount by which the water levels have risen correlates to his feeling of buoyancy, and that this provides a brilliant solution to his vexing problem. Having had this flash of insight, Archimedes then goes to more straightforwardly apply his expertise, to devise the experiment to implement his solution to determine the authenticity of the crown. So what I'm walking you through is an initial effort of expertise that then incites a further effort of imagination that then compels again a further effort of expertise. And this is generally how our problem-solving processes involve oscillations between expertise and imagination, such that each enhances the other. And it's no different for we international lawyers, but for the sorts of expertise and the sorts of imagination that we employ. But to see where neurosis lies, we need to go to the fabric of an international lawyer's mentality, the nuts and bolts of our mentality. And so far, I've described that psychical fabric to you in terms of conscious processes, acts of expertise, acts of imagination. But as we have seen, psychoanalysis tells us that neurosis lies in an individual's unconscious mind. So what can we say about these unconscious processes in the mind? Well, neuroscience tells us that the unfolding of our conscious experience is actually something more like a dynamic ballet between fundamental unconscious processes and fundamental conscious processes. And so if we return to our problem-solving efforts, we can understand the conscious acts of applying expertise and applying imagination as themselves being oscillations between fundamental unconscious processes and fundamental conscious processes that are nested within that higher level problem-solving oscillation that goes on in a problem solver's mind. And this allows us to see exactly where neurosis seeps in. Neurosis begins at the level of unconscious processes, seeping upwards to infect our oscillations between expertise and imagination. And this is quite literally how neurosis can come to infect the psychical fabric of everyday international order. But to borrow a metaphor often attributed to Freud, the mind is like an iceberg, conscious life being the tip of a much vaster unconscious foundations below the water's surface. And as we've seen, neurosis lies there in that vast reservoir of the unconscious. But we want to ask, what else may lie in this vast reservoir of the unconscious? Well, altruism is a mental force that's quite natural to our minds, that too has its unconscious foundations. And I mean altruism in its most common sense of a selfless act having no other purpose than pure goodness towards another, quite irrespective of oneself. If we reflect on the unfolding of everyday experience, we find examples of this everywhere. We have each of us all held the door open for another, and we each have our stories of public heroism that we can tell. And each of these behaviors is a response to a fundamental altruistic impulse that is naturally there in the brain. In fact, neuroscience tells us that the empathetic feelings and behaviors that compel such altruistic behavior are themselves owed to unconscious processes in the mind, what is called the altruistic brain. So, if our neurosis can infect an international lawyer's psyche by seeping upwards from the unconscious level, then the altruism that we discover naturally there in our unconscious foundations can glide upwards to instill decency into international order. But let's step further than that. It's been a thought that each of us have had at one point or another, that if we all acted more altruistically, we could so easily bring about a better world. And it's only in the register of cynicism that we quickly or even automatically dismiss this thought as simple naive optimism. But the strong sense says that altruism invites the sorts of behavior that compel social change. Consider that it's a remarkable fact that we each have the altruistic tendency to go out of our way to unconditionally encourage the young children that we interact with, no matter who the child is. We cannot help but search in a child's words and actions for the raw potential in how they are in order to encourage it to flourish in the world. And we tend to set aside the miserly belief that ours is a world set in stone when dealing with them. This experience of unconditional encouragement of young children reveals some important features of altruism. The unconditional encouragement of children shows that altruism can be willful, that is, a cognitive act of a directing, demanding kind. We recognize the child's potential as something that stands in need of encouragement. It should be so, it must become so, is the very form that that recognition takes. And this willful sort of altruism is also anticipatory and concrete. One is honed in upon the potential in how the child already is in order to realize that potential and allow it to flourish. And this willfulness, this anticipatory concreteness, are all core elements of what Ernst Bloch, the father of contemporary utopianism, argues for. So altruism is our engine for driving Blochian utopianism. Now, Blochian utopianism is not the popular notion of utopia, that is, some naively optimistic wish for a dream world. It is rather speaking about an everyday active process of social transformation that's anchored in reality. It is an active process. It is a process of unconditionally encouraging what potential for expanding oneself and expanding one's society lies already there, latent in our most everyday routines and practices. And this Blochian utopianism instills in we international lawyers an audacious hunger for what possibilities are there latent in our everyday practices. And so we international lawyers can come to regard, under the sway of utopianism, the international order as a work as yet unfinished, yearning for completion. And it's only this utopian hunger for the new that can defeat our neurosis and bring about a better international order. This utopian hunger for the new is what I call altruistic hope. But what does this mean for each of us? What I'm trying to show is that neurosis does not just beset us in our international order. It too points us towards its antidote in altruism, an altruism that we all possess. Perhaps the most shocking fact about our neurotic international order is that we seem to maintain only a casual relationship with this altruistic impulse that is almost ours. We defeat neurosis by quite literally returning ourselves to ourselves. And in our most everyday routine lives, this is the task of educating our altruistic impulse into an altruistic hope that supplants neurosis in our unconscious foundations and brings about a better international order. Thank you.